Hello, my name is Ed Eckel, and I am a scholarly communications, copyright, and licensing librarian at the WMU Libraries. Welcome to Navigating Fair Use. Many graduate students end up using images, tables, or other copyrighted materials in their dissertations and theses without realizing that they may need permission for this, or that some of their use is covered by the U.S. Copyright Fair Use Clause. This workshop is aimed at graduate students and their faculty advisors. It will provide you with an understanding of best practices for making a case for fair use in academic writing. I also want to add a disclaimer here. I am not a lawyer. I am just a librarian who is highlighting issues that you should be aware of as you plan to use other authors' creative works in your dissertation, thesis, or research article. You can access the slide set itself at the URL and QR code shown here. In this presentation, I will cover what the WMU requirements are for using copyrighted material in your dissertation or thesis, what copyright and fair use are, highlight some examples of appropriate fair use, and discuss other options that you have for using copyrighted materials. As a graduate student or researcher, you may be using research that involves the use of other copyrighted materials. These materials can include, for example, materials such as those listed here. In addition to using these materials in your research, you may wish to use some portion of them in your actual published writing. This is where you need to understand your legal options. It is one thing to use material in your personal research. It is another thing to then use parts of that other person's work in your own publication. WMU's Graduate College has a set of guidelines on the web called the Thesis and Dissertation Guidelines. This document includes a section on copyright and fair use. This section states that the ProQuest database company to which WMU will send your dissertation or thesis for online archiving will review your manuscript for possible infringement of copyright. The Graduate College advises all students to either make a fair use case for copyrighted material they are using or to request permission. You actually have a couple of other options besides just requesting permission or fair use. You can choose to use materials that have been licensed with a Creative Commons license, or to use materials that are in the public domain and so are not under copyright protection. I will address all of these options in this video. To understand your options, you must first understand a little bit about copyright. What is copyright and why does it exist? Copyright exists in all countries of the world, but varies from country to country. So I'm going to talk about copyright in the United States. Copyright exists to encourage creation of new works by allowing creators to temporarily benefit from their creations by selling or distributing copies. It is governed in the U.S. by Title 17 of the U.S. Code. Title 17 covers any work fixed in any tangible medium of expression, published or unpublished. So the work must exist out in the world, not just in your head or as something you recite to someone else. The work must also have originality, meaning it was independently created by a human author and has a minimal degree of creativity. Copyright does not protect ideas or facts. Copyright provides exclusive rights to the creator, including you. Anything you create that is fixed in a tangible form is automatically covered under copyright in the US. Although, if you wish to sue someone for copyright infringement, you should probably officially register your work. The exclusive rights to the creator include the right to copy and distribute the work, make money by selling it, and make derivative works, such as taking your dissertation and breaking it up into separate articles for publication. Copyright does not last forever. Congress decided to make copyright temporary so that eventually other people could use works as the basis to create new works. Currently, in the US, the duration of copyright is for the life of the creator plus 70 years, although anonymous works and works for hire are more complicated. In addition to limiting copyright in terms of how long it lasts, Congress has also carved out of copyright two major limitations. One is fair use, and the other is Section 108, that governs the making of copies in and by libraries and archives. I'm going to focus on fair use right now, although both are important for your research and learning. At the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about creators having exclusive rights over the copying of their works for a limited time. However, U.S. copyright law acknowledges that if creators kept all their copyrights over their work, we would not be able to use their creations other than viewing, reading, or listening to them. Using a work, whether for personal study, for teaching, for scholarship, for commentary, or creating accessible versions for people with disabilities, often requires making copies or transforming the work in some way. Section 107 of the Copyright Code states that we may use or copy other creators' copyrighted works for purposes such as news reporting, criticism, commentary, teaching, and scholarship and research without infringing copyright. Note that the section shown here that says for purposes such as is non-exclusive. It is not saying that these are the only accepted examples of fair use, but that these examples illustrate what fair use covers. You may not have realized this, but you depend upon fair use all the time when you're using works for your own research or learning. Fair use is not a cut and dried exception. Congress realized that it could not specify every appropriate use ahead of time, so they left fair use fuzzy. It must be handled on a case-by-case basis. You must make a case for fair use by considering these four factors, which are also specified in Section 107. These are: 1. The purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or is of nonprofit educational nature. The nature of the copyrighted work. 3. The amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And 4. The effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. As you consider what you want to use and why, ask yourself the following questions. In particular, focus on why you need to use the work, how much of the work you plan to use, and is your use transformative? Meaning, are you doing something new with the work, or are you just reproducing it without really recontextualizing the work? The following bits of advice come from Kenneth Kruse' 2013 report on copyright issues in dissertations and theses. This is linked on the web and is also linked to in the WMU Dissertation and Thesis Guidelines document. Kruse is a copyright lawyer and librarian, so his advice is very solid and trustworthy. As I mentioned earlier, you need to show that you are placing the work you are using in a new context, particularly in the context of your scholarly study. Make sure to place the images or other materials in close coordination with the section of your dissertation or thesis where you discuss those materials, so that you are transparent in your use of them. For images and figures, copyright librarian Kenneth Kruse recommends using small, low-resolution versions, preferably in black and white. The reason for this is so that a reader cannot substitute your version of the image for the original and thus affect the market for the original work. Remember, you want to minimize the chance that you will get pushback from ProQuest or another publisher on your thesis or dissertation. For this video, I'd like to show you a couple of nice, relevant examples of the use of copyrighted works in dissertations or theses. These are from one thesis and one dissertation from the ProQuest Dissertations and Theses database. And my use of these in this presentation video is an example of fair use. I need you to understand what fair use might look like in the real world. To do that, I have to use real examples. My first example is from Peter Edgar at the University of Alabama. His master's thesis from 2024 examines the Instagram poetry of a Canadian poet named Rupi Kaur. On page 37 of his thesis, Mr. Edgar discusses what specifically he is analyzing in Ms. Kaur's poetry and social media presence. He mentions his methodology and the theoretical context for his analysis. On page 42, The author discusses a comparison between Rupi Kaur's Instagram landing page and that of another poet who uses Instagram, C.A. Conrad, and the differences in how they use their Instagram presence. On page 43, Mr. Edgar shows those Instagram pages side by side so that you can see them in comparison. Here is one last example from Edgar from page 45 and 46 of his thesis. On these pages, he discusses figure 4, shown here, which shows a typical Kaur post of a short poem along with reader responses. The text near this figure, shown at the top, discusses the brevity of Kaur's poetry and her explanation of why she displays her poems the way she does. For my next example, I'm using a WMU doctoral dissertation from 2024 by Dr. Anita Zanstra. Dr. Zanstra's dissertation explored the, quote, construction of social identity and social difference in and through a Bolivian comedy series produced during the presidency of Evo Morales from 2006 to 2019, unquote. On page 168 of her dissertation, Dr. Zanstra uses a table from another publication. While she might have been able to use this table under fair use, she decided to request and was granted permission to use the table. Note, in the section in purple at the bottom, she explicitly states this under the table. On page 175, Dr. Zanstra analyzes and discusses images of particular political and ethnic groups in Bolivia that were used in this comedy series. But for this to really make sense, she has to show these images. Here you can see figures from the television show, plus the description of these images and what ethnic groups are being stereotyped. Note the close coordination of the images with the text. It is important that the author be very clear why these copyrighted images are being reproduced in the dissertation. Now I would like to highlight a couple of other options that you have for using other creators' materials. One is to find and use materials that are already covered by a Creative Commons or CC license, which generally allows use for scholarly or creative purposes with attribution of the author. Creative Commons licenses are licenses whereby a creator or author can decide ahead of time to allow other people to use their materials or works without having to ask permission or pay a fee. All CC licenses require a user to attribute the author or creator. This is the CC BY portion of the license, shown in the bullet points on the left. Then the licenses may have other stipulations, such as sharing the work under a similar license, SA, using the work non-commercially, NC, or not making derivatives or variations on the work, ND. Works that have Creative Commons licenses usually will display a logo like the one on this slide, which represents CC BY. Finding a CC license on a work can be tricky. You do have to look for it. In this case, the license information is displayed under the bibliographic information section on the article landing page. In the PDF version of that same article, the CC license is displayed on the bottom of the first page. Your other option for using other people's work is to use a work that is in the public domain. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, copyright does not last forever. Once a work's copyright expires, the work enters what is called the public domain. This means the work is no longer under copyright protection and can be used for scholarly and creative purposes without permission. You should still attribute the author and source so that your reader knows where you got this content from. Works in the public domain will generally be works that were published before 1930, with a few exceptions. If you decide that you need to ask permission to use a copyrighted work, say a figure or a table, it may be getting a little easier, at least in the STEM or science fields. There is a group of scholarly publishers in the sciences that have created a voluntary set of guidelines that allow authors to reuse limited amounts of material from each other's published works without payment. You would have to check that your publisher is one of the signatories to the agreement, which is available via the link here in my Google Slides. In addition, some journals, such as the journal Science, are becoming more flexible about allowing students to use figures and tables in dissertations and theses. Always check the guidelines for the publisher of the material you wish to use. Finally, do not wait until the last minute to get permission, if that is what you need to do. Publishers can be very slow to get back to you on this. And note that authors may not be the rights holder for a work. Most scholarly authors have signed over their copyrights to the publisher of their work. Make the scholarly need for the work you are using transparent by making reference to it and placing it in close coordination with your text. Don't use other creators' images or figures as decoration. If you cannot get permission from the copyright holder and cannot make a strong fair use case for the source, you may be forced to drop it from your dissertation, thesis, or article. Again, I am not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you any legal advice or counsel, simply highlighting copyright and fair use issues that you should be aware of. If you are still concerned about any legal liability, you might want to talk to a lawyer or even WMU General Counsel. Or you could wait and discuss this with the editors of a journal of interest. In my Google Slides, you will see a slide with links to supplementary materials that you might find useful. One of these is a fair use checklist that our library has adapted from one at the Copyright Advisory Office of Columbia University, which was developed by Kenneth Cruz and Wayne Butler. When you need to consider whether or not to use someone's work under fair use, it is a good idea to complete this checklist and include it in your dissertation or thesis to show that you have done your due diligence in making a fair use case. I have posted a set of 4 fair use case study examples for you to consider at this web address down at the bottom. The WMU Libraries has a copyright and fair use guide available at this web address. This guide has promotional materials on copyright and fair use, as well as my contact information for questions. And here are the sources that I referred to in this video. Thank you for viewing this presentation. If you have any questions, please contact me. You can even make an appointment for a copyright or fair use consultation with me.